Ever wonder why everything suddenly costs more? Your rent, your groceries, even your favorite coffee that somehow jumped from $4 to $6 overnight? You're not alone. Here's the thing. The world doesn't run on luck or magic. It runs on economics. And whether you realize it or not, you've been playing the economics game since the day you traded your lunch for someone else's snacks in school. Economics isn't just for people in suits or folks arguing about interest rates on TV. It's literally the study of why you can't have everything you want and what you do about it instead. Every time you decide between staying in bed or getting up for work, buying that gadget now or saving for later, you're making economic choices. But here's where it gets fun. Economics isn't just about money. It's about why we do what we do, how entire countries grow or collapse, and why some people seem to get richer while others are stuck trying to catch up. It's the hidden engine behind every decision, every trade, and every time you've asked yourself, why is this so expensive? By the end of this video, you'll understand how this invisible system secretly runs your life and how you can use it to make smarter, better, and maybe even richer choices. Because once you get how economics really works, everything else from your paycheck to your next vacation makes sense. Let's start with the most uncomfortable truth in economics. There is never enough of anything. Not enough time, not enough money, not enough fries in the bag, no matter how hard you hope. That is what economists call scarcity. It is the reason you cannot have everything you want, and neither can anyone else. Every single decision you make is shaped by the fact that the world has limits. You have only so much time in a day, so much money in your account, and so much energy before your brain taps out. If the world had infinite pizza, or endless vacation days, or an unlimited supply of chill, economics would not even exist. There would be no choices to make. Everyone could have everything. But because reality is a little stingy, we have to choose. And that is where the game begins. Scarcity forces you to prioritize. It is why governments debate budgets, why companies fight for resources, and why you sometimes end up choosing instant noodles over sushi. Every system in the world, from your grocery list to global trade, is basically one giant strategy session about how to deal with not having enough. Once you start thinking about life through that lens, you will notice scarcity everywhere, from housing shortages and limited edition sneakers to your never-ending search for free time. So if scarcity is the problem, then the next question is obvious. How do we decide what to do with what we have? So now that we know life is basically a buffet with way too many empty trays, what do? We choose. Every choice you make, big or small, has a price, not just in money, but in what you give up. Economists call that opportunity cost. It sounds fancy, but it is really just the thing you did not choose. Think about it. Watching this video right now means you are not watching cat fails or scrolling endlessly through social media. That is your opportunity cost, and I would like to think you made the right choice. You cannot go to every party, take every job offer, or invest in every coin that claims it is the next Bitcoin. Life is a constant trade-off between what you want now and what you might want later. Even governments deal with opportunity cost. Build more roads, that is less money for schools. Spend on defense, that is less for healthcare. Every decision means saying no to something else, even when both options sound good. Once you see the world this way, it is almost impossible to unsee it. Every yes you say hides a dozen invisible no's. That is the silent math behind your time, money, and happiness. So how do we make those choices a little less painful? Simple. We start swapping what we have for what we want. In other words, we trade. All right, so we have scarcity in choices. You have something I want and I have something you need. What happens next? We trade. Trade is basically humanity's favorite hack for not having everything. You grow apples, I grow bananas, we swap, and suddenly both of us have a fruit salad instead of a one-item diet. Everybody wins unless one of us is allergic, in which case it is still kind of a win, just with a side of EpiPen. But here's where it gets clever. Even if someone is worse at everything, trade can still make everyone better off. It is called comparative advantage. Let us say you are bad at cooking and cleaning, but you are slightly less terrible at cleaning. You focus on that while your roommate, who is less bad at cooking, handles the kitchen. Boom, you both save time, stress, and at least one argument. That is the heart of trade. It is not about who is the best, it is about who is the least worst at the right thing. And once people start realizing that, specialization follows. This happens. Bakers bake, builders build, and someone somewhere gets paid to rate all of it online. Before you know it, you have markets, giant systems where people, companies, and even countries trade what they are good at for what they need. So now the question becomes, how do these markets actually work? Who decides what is worth what? And why does a coffee suddenly cost more than lunch? Let us dive into that next. Markets and incentives. Once people start trading, something magical happens, not fairy tale magical, more like the feeling of finally getting what you want. That is how markets are born. A market is just a place where people exchange stuff. It can be a giant stock exchange, your local farmer's market, or that sketchy online forum where people trade game accounts and somehow think it is a good idea. Wherever buyers and sellers meet, that is a market. But markets do not just run on stuff. They run on motives. That is where incentives come in. Incentives are the invisible strings that make people move, the tiny what's in it for me voice that drives every action. If pizza costs $100, nobody is buying. Drop it to $1 and suddenly half the city is on their way. That is demand in action. On the flip side, if everyone is willing to pay $50 for a slice, guess what? Every pizza shop in town is staying open until 3 a.m. That is supply responding to incentive. This constant tug of war between buyers and sellers is what keeps markets alive, and prices constantly change. It is the economy's way of balancing everyone's wants and limits at the same time. And when those forces meet just right, something cool happens. A balance point called equilibrium. That is the magic number where everyone who wants to buy finds someone who wants to sell. But what happens when prices do not play fair, when governments, greed, or chaos mess with the balance? That is when markets start acting weird and things like inflation and shortages occur. Overpriced coffee takes over. So let's see what really happens when prices go wild and why everything suddenly feels more expensive than it used to. So let's talk about everyone's favorite mystery. Why does everything keep getting more expensive? Rent, groceries, movie tickets, even your favorite snack that quietly shrank in size but went up in price. Yep, that is inflation's sneaky little cousin, shrinkflation. At its core, inflation just means prices rising over time. But the why is where things get messy. Sometimes demand goes crazy, like when everyone suddenly wants the same thing at once. Remember when toilet paper was the new gold? That is demand outpacing supply. Other times, supply takes a hit. Droughts ruin crops, fuel prices spike, shipping costs soar, and suddenly your avocado toast costs $14. That is called a supply shock. Less stuff available, same number of people wanting it, higher prices for everyone. And then there's the classic, too much money floating around. When people have more to spend but the number of goods stays the same, prices rise. It is simple math. More money chasing the same amount of stuff equals inflation. But not all inflation is bad. A little bit keeps the economy humming, encouraging people to spend and invest. The real problem comes when prices climb faster than your paycheck. That is when inflation turns from a whatever into wait, how is this cereal $12? And sometimes both demand and supply crash at once. That is stagflation. Imagine paying more for everything while also losing your job. It is like the economy saying, surprise, you get the worst of both worlds. So when prices spin out of control, who is supposed to fix it? That is when we meet the mysterious referee of money itself, the people who actually decide how much cash flows through the system. Let us talk about the real puppet masters of the economy, money and banks. Let's be honest, money runs everything. But what is it really? Paper? Numbers on a screen? A collective daydream we all decided to believe in? Pretty much. Money only works because we trust it. The moment that trust breaks, it's just colored paper and bad Wi-Fi connections. If enough people believe something has value, it does. If they stop, it doesn't. That's the entire magic trick. Before money, people had to barter. You would trade a goat for bread or a bag of rice for some tools. It worked until someone said, "Hey, what if I don't want your goat?" That's when money came along to make trade simple. Money acts as a middleman, a medium of exchange. It's also a store of value, you can save it for later, and a unit of account. It lets us measure stuff. Basically, it's the world's most convenient IOU system. But here's where things get tricky. Banks. Banks take your money, promise to keep it safe, and then lend most of it to someone else. It sounds sketchy, but that's how the system keeps moving. When banks give loans, they're actually creating new money, not by printing cash, but by typing numbers into your account. Congratulations, your mortgage just increased the money supply. This is called fractional reserve banking. Banks only keep a fraction of deposits on hand, lending the rest out. It's a neat trick that works beautifully until everyone wants their money back at once. That's a bank run. That's why deposit insurance exists, to stop people from panicking. In the US, that's the FDIC. In other countries, it's something similar. Basically, it's a system that says, relax, your cash isn't under the mattress, but it's safe. Probably. But here's the twist. If banks can create money out of thin air, who's in charge of the real money supply? Who decides how much money? That's where the real power sits, with central banks. So now we know money moves through banks like caffeine through your bloodstream. But governments? They've got their own way of keeping the economy alive, and it starts with taxes. Taxes are basically the membership fee for living in a functioning country. Roads, hospitals, schools, firefighters, none of that exists without them. In return, you get things like public safety, clean water, and hopefully not too many potholes. There are all kinds of taxes. Income tax takes a slice of your paycheck. Sales tax grabs a piece every time you buy something. Property tax is the price you pay for owning anything with walls, and corporate tax makes sure companies chip in too, at least in theory. It sounds fair enough until you realize governments rarely collect as much as they spend. When they overspend, they borrow. A lot. And that's how we get something called the national debt. When spending is bigger than revenue, that's a deficit. The government fills the gap by selling bonds, basically IOUs that say buy this and we'll pay you back later with interest. If you've ever bought a government bond, congrats, you've lent money to your country. Now, a little debt isn't bad. It's how governments fund big stuff. Highways, schools, emergency relief, even space programs. The problem comes when the debt grows faster than the economy itself. That's like maxing out your credit card to pay off another one. Eventually, the interest payments alone become a whole budget line, money spent just to pay back old money. That's called debt servicing. And if things get really ugly, a country might default, meaning it can't pay back what it owes. Think Greece in 2012 or Argentina, well, multiple times. Still, debt isn't automatically evil. Used wisely, it helps build the future. Used poorly, it digs a hole future generations have to crawl out of. And while governments are busy juggling debt and taxes, but there is something much bigger happening in the background. A worldwide network of countries trading, competing, and depending on each other for survival. That is where the story zooms out into global trade, currencies, and how one ship getting stuck in a canal can cost the planet billions. Take a step back and look at the world. It is basically one massive marketplace. Every country is buying, selling, and swapping something with someone else. Nobody makes everything they need, so trade keeps the lights on. Maybe your country grows coffee but cannot build cars. Another country builds cars but cannot grow coffee. Boom, trade. Everyone gets what they want and both sides win. That is called comparative advantage, doing what you are best at and trading for the rest. Free trade makes life cheaper and more efficient. You get more options, better technology, and yes, your smartphone exists because half a dozen countries decided to work together, sort of. But not everyone wins equally. Some jobs move overseas, some industries vanish, and that is where things get political fast. When governments want to protect local jobs, they use protectionism. That means tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. It sounds good until prices rise and the rest of us pay more for the same stuff. Then there is currency. Every trade deal needs an exchange rate, the price of one country's money in another's. If one US dollar gets you 150 yen, great. But if it suddenly gets you 100 yen, your next trip to Tokyo just got more expensive. Currencies constantly rise and fall based on demand, trust, interest rates, and the occasional political drama. When a currency loses value, that is depreciation. It helps exports but makes imports painful. When it rises, that is appreciation, great for buying foreign goods. And when things go really wrong, like a country borrowing too much in foreign currency and then watching its own value crash, that is a currency crisis. It has happened to Mexico, Thailand, Argentina, and a few others who would rather not talk about it. Global trade sounds unstoppable until it isn't. Remember when one ship blocked the Suez Canal and froze 12% of global trade? That single event cost billions. It is a reminder that globalization, for all its brilliance, runs on a fragile system of moving parts. And behind all those trades, shipments, and price swings are the people actually doing the work, the labor force. They are the real economy in motion. So next, let us talk about you, jobs, wages, and why no one ever seems to agree on what fair pay really means. Now let us bring economics down to the level that actually matters. You. You wake up, go to work, trade your time for money, and hope your paycheck can survive rent day. Welcome to labor economics. Jobs are just another kind of market, but instead of buying stuff, companies buy time. They pay for skills, effort, and caffeine-fueled productivity. The price in this market is your wage. In theory, high demand for workers means higher wages. Low demand means less. But reality is not that tidy. People are not machines. We get tired, distracted, or just decide we are not doing emails after 6 p.m. And that messy human side makes labor markets unpredictable. Employers only hire if you bring in more value than you cost. That is called marginal revenue product. If you make $100 worth of value an hour, but earn $25, the rest goes to the company. That is how profits happen. Fair? Maybe. Efficient? Definitely. And when things go wrong, like recessions, layoffs, or robots taking jobs, we get unemployment. It comes in all flavors, frictional, structural. Sometimes the economy is cyclical. Either way, being statistically invisible isn't much comfort when the bills keep coming. That is why we have minimum wage, a baseline meant to protect workers from being paid peanuts. Raise it a little, and it helps people. Raise it too much, and some companies start replacing workers with touchscreens that never need lunch breaks. Then there is the wage gap. Some people earn a lot more than others, sometimes because of skill or experience, sometimes because of luck, discrimination, or who got the head start. CEOs once made 20 times more than workers. Now they make 350 times as much. The math has not changed, just the incentives. And speaking of incentives, let us talk about how humans actually make decisions, because spoiler alert, we are not nearly as logical as we think. That is behavioral economics, the study of why we buy stuff we do not need, chase deals that are not deals, and panic buy toilet paper during a crisis. We overvalue the present, a tendency called hyperbolic discounting. We hate losing more than we love winning, called loss aversion. And we follow crowds even when we should not, called herd behavior. Half our choices are emotional shortcuts dressed up as logic. Governments and apps know this, which is why they nudge us. Automatic savings, default subscriptions, screens that ask whether you are sure you want to cancel. They all use psychology to steer behavior without forcing it. It is kind of brilliant and kind of terrifying. But it works. Because in the end, economics is not just about money. It is about people trying to make sense of limited choices with unlimited feelings. And when all those messy human decisions add up, they shape something much bigger, entire systems that decide how the world runs. So next, let us see how different countries try to answer the same question. Who gets what and why? Every society faces the same three questions. What do we make? How do we make it? And who gets it? The answers depend on what kind of system you're living in. Let's start with capitalism. It's all about private ownership, free markets, and incentives. You work, you earn, you spend. It's great for innovation and growth, but it also tends to pile up wealth at the top. Think billionaires, stock markets, and companies that somehow own everything from your phone to your fridge. Then there is socialism. Here, the goal is equality. Resources and industries are often publicly owned or tightly regulated to make sure everyone gets a fair share. It sounds good on paper, but it can dull motivation. If your reward is the same no matter how hard you work, why work harder? Take it a step further and you get communism, a fully planned system where the government controls everything. No private property, no market prices, no competition. It promises fairness, but usually ends up with breadlines, bureaucracy, and zero incentive to improve. Most countries do not go all in on one system. Instead, they mix and match. That is a mixed economy. The United States, China, India, most of Europe, all of them blend market freedom with government control in different doses. In the United States, you have capitalism with social programs, public schools, welfare, and social security. In Scandinavia, you get high taxes, but also free college and healthcare. In China, there is capitalism under government oversight. Billionaires exist, but they still answer to the state. Every system has trade-offs. Capitalism creates wealth but breeds inequality. Socialism reduces inequality but risks inefficiency. And pure communism usually collapses under the weight of its own paperwork. There is no perfect answer, just different ways of managing the same problem: scarcity. The world keeps experimenting, adjusting, and arguing over where the line between freedom and fairness should be. And that brings us full circle back to the real meaning of economics. So what did we just uncover? Economics isn't a bunch of scarcity means you can't have it all. Choices mean you've got to give something up. Trade lets you turn what you have into what you need. Money keeps that trade flowing. Systems from capitalism to socialism are just different ways of answering the same impossible question. How do we share a limited world? Every price tag, every paycheck, every policy comes from those ideas. When you buy coffee, you're not just spending a few dollars. You are participating in a global network of farmers, shippers, baristas, and economists who all made that moment possible. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Economics stops being this scary word from school and starts looking like what it really is, the story of people trying to get the most out of what little they have. So next time someone says, "I'm bad at economics," you can tell them they are actually doing it every day, every time they budget, save, argue over dinner, or choose between working late and watching another episode. Because at the end of the day, economics isn't about money, it's about choices. And if you understand your choices, you already understand how the world works. And that's the secret. Once you start seeing life through the lens of economics, everything suddenly makes sense, from your paycheck to your pizza order.